a guide to art, activism, and culture. I'm your host, Soy Elena. This podcast is brought to you by the Aragram Center for Arts and Culture, bringing the voices of today's creativity to you. Before we begin, please consider donating by going to our website at www.aragram.org/support. Your contributions are why our events and programs like these are possible with no paywall, so that everyone can participate for free worldwide. Thank you. Today's topic, nothing about us without us. Joining me is archaeologist and museum professional James Doyle, whose curatorial practice activates objects for university teaching, scholarly research, and public education on the material and visual cultures of the ancient Americas. James previously served as the assistant curator for arts of the ancient Americas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was a postdoctoral associate in pre-Columbian studies at Dunbar and Oaks, and is currently the director of the Matson Museum of Anthropology and an associate research professor of anthropology at Penn State University.
Thank you, James, for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you. Today we'll be speaking about your recent exhibition, Arte del Mar, which was hosted at the Met. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is James Doyle. I am an archaeologist and museum professional. I'm currently the director of the Matson Museum of Anthropology at Penn State University. And formerly, I was the assistant curator for art of the ancient Americas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we put on the exhibition Arte del Mar that you mentioned.
Which closed at June 27 of last year. And the works were chosen from the Met's collection to highlight the interconnections between pre-conquest Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, and Honduras. What led to the exhibition? What was your vision and goal for executing it? The story that you wanted to tell?
Sure. I mean, basically, the Met collection has a lot of very iconic pieces from the Caribbean region. And this is sort of pre-COVID goal was in 2020, the Met turned 150 years old. And so I was given the opportunity to propose an exhibition that would kind of celebrate that anniversary in a way that would resonate with the work that we were doing with the Ancient Americas collection. And so previously I had worked on a couple of projects that highlighted the lack of recent public engagement with the art and archaeology of the Caribbean region. And so I wanted to kind of highlight the Met collection, but also in a way that brought more attention to the exciting advances in scholarship in what is now the Greater Antilles and the northern part of South America and southern Central America. Really, the scholarly goal was to bring this regional look to the forefront. Rather than just focusing on, say, the Taínos of the Greater Antilles, we wanted to really draw these visual and material connections between island and mainland. And that was really the main goal. And so the focus of the exhibition were the works from the Taíno civilizations, which is sort of post 1000 AD in the Greater Antilles, but in conversation with other works from Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, as well as going as far north in Honduras. And my specialty is in the ancient Maya area. So I sort of purposefully really focused on the neighbors of the Maya. So I didn't really go into the story of the Caribbean Yucatan Peninsula, for example, which is also a really interesting time period in interaction or I guess proposed interactions between the Caribbean societies and the Maya peoples, Maya speaking peoples in what is now Mexico and Guatemala. So in the end, I think it was really exciting for people to see that the Taínos were just a part of this big network of societies that were connected by the Caribbean Sea before European colonization. So I'm really happy with the way that we were able to get that information out to the public.
And I'm actually a little mistaken in my questions because I noted that this was the Met's first exhibition on Taíno art, and it is not. There was one, the Taíno art of the Dominican Republic that was exhibited in 1985. And so looking back, there's a huge period where there isn't any exhibitions on Taíno art. So what was something that you wanted to add on top of that previous exhibition? The progression of how an exhibition story is told. What were some of the changes and adaptations to research and to presentation?
Sure. Yeah. I'll actually rewind a little bit further because in 1970, during the centennial, which was the 100-year anniversary of the Met, the big sort of anchor exhibition was called Before Cortez. And that was about sculpture from Middle America. And that included actually Taíno works too. So there was this kind of recognition by the Met back in the day that the Taínos were part of this larger story of sculptural traditions in, what is now Mexico and Central America. And so then actually in 1973, there was another exhibition at the Met that was a partnership with El Museo del Barrio that was specifically on Puerto Rico from pre-Columbian to the present. And so that was called the Art Heritage of Puerto Rico, La Herencia Artística de Puerto Rico. So that actually was one of the first times that Taíno art was presented as part of this long tradition of Puerto Rican art. And that actually to date is probably the largest survey of art from Puerto Rico at all ever. The 1985 exhibition focused on a specific collection from the Dominican Republic. And with Arte del Mar, I sort of wanted to build on all of those prior projects, both to bring back that focus of Puerto Rico, obviously, because of course, New York and Puerto Rico have a lot of linkages. Also to, like I said, kind of really emphasize that the Taínos were trading with all of these other peoples. And there were these connections. The Caribbean Sea wasn't necessarily like a passive surface that people were just traveling over. It really was a connector in the time before the Spanish colonizers arrived. That was kind of where I wanted to differentiate Arte del Mar. And in fact, after the 1985 exhibition at the Met, there was a big exhibition, and that's, I think, one of the most memorable exhibitions of Taíno art was in the mid-90s at El Museo del Barrio. So they did a big exhibition of Taíno art at El Museo, and that was also followed by a big exhibition at the Petit Palais in Paris of Taíno art. So I think in the 90s, there was a lot going on, just not necessarily at the Met itself. Really, I think the point of putting something on like Arte del Mar in 2020 at the Met in New York was also to build connections to the vibrant Caribbean story that is New York City, that is the cultural contribution of Caribbean peoples and people descended from the Caribbean in New York. And so for that reason, while we had lots of higher expectations for programming that we could do with contemporary artists and community organizations that were sort of turned online and sort of adapted for COVID, but it was important for me to not have that be a time capsule as in prior exhibitions, and really build a bridge to the present for to the 20th century, but also into today for modern and contemporary art.
In an interview with Hyperallergic, you discussed the misconceptions that the Taíno people no longer exist, having been wiped out by diseases brought by the Spanish conquistadors in the 15th century. And you've already been touching on this a little bit, but when presenting objects in a museum, how are you balancing the exhibition narrative and the research with that of memory and identity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there was also a great sort of collaborative exhibition that happened at the National Museum of the American Indian in 2018 that tackled this very question of the sort of erroneous history of the Taínos that by the mid 16th century, they were all gone, because there is a lot of evidence recently from various disciplines like genetic research and also social anthropology and cuisine and linguistics that really show the pervasive continuities of Taíno heritage in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. So that was another kind of project that Arte del Mar built off of, that, we could kind of just start from saying it's not the Taíno were, it's that they began as such and still are. So there's a lot greater recognition of indigeneity in both the Caribbean region, but also, like I said, in New York, a lot more people identify as Taíno. I even had people from the public come up to me after events for Arte del Mar and say, I am from Puerto Rico. I just took a DNA test and it says I have this ancestry and I'm so happy to learn about this. And I guess it was surprising a little bit to me, but, and of course I didn't want to equate DNA with your identity. Like you're constructing your own story there, but I'm happy to, connect people to the latest information about the Taínos and their civilization so that they can learn more as they wish. I was gratified because you never know if people are going to read your wall labels, but I think it's about word choice as well. As a curator, you have to think about how can we dispel those myths without spending a lot of real estate on that label copy, right? So it's about elevating the way we speak about the Taínos in general, and also elevating the way we speak about the works that we're looking at. For example, we had at least 4 of these ceremonial seats. They're known as dujos, and they are really fascinating objects because they are these beautiful fusions of like the form of a hammock, but also the spirit of the Zemí. So the Zemí is a word that we discussed a lot in the exhibition. That's this Taíno word for deities or ancestors or specific god images. In the labels, we tried to really say things like, you can really consider these as portable thrones. Like these aren't just seats. They're not just functional everyday chairs. This is something that has a story, has a biography, had this ceremonial value to the peoples that made them and still to their descendants today. So that was another goal of mine, was to really elevate the way we talk about these objects, because I think in the past there was this obsession with sort of putting people into different schemes of complexity with a capital C. And it's just so counterproductive, because when you actually read the firsthand accounts of, say, the Spanish friars that are talking to the Taínos and living with them, it's all about royal courts and ritual and belief and origin stories. And, it's not about something that is less complex than something else, right? It's really, we can kind of step back a bit and think, how can we present this to the public, but grow an appreciation in this collection, in this exhibition, that you have to have for other works of art that may be more familiar.
As a young curator and researcher, looking at exhibitions as part of my research, started to struggle with the display of ethnographic objects in an art museum because I see the disconnect between an object's use in daily life with the descriptive language of art. So if I came to you as a young curator, what guidance would you give me? And at what level does that language get decided or is used reflectively? That's
a great question. And I think my experience is that museum audiences are asking more for honesty and for forthright language that doesn't obfuscate or redirect the past in a way that sort of obscures the violence of colonialism or sweeping things under the rug. So you want to acknowledge the history and be forthright about it, but you also don't want to be a downer, right? You don't want it to all be about negativity, because what people come to the museum for is to be inspired, to learn something. And so to find that balance of this sort of honest, forthright telling of history and kind of getting people excited about what you're presenting is a difficult one to strike in labels. But I think, you can make small choices, like instead of saying, like, stop using words like conquistador or explorer or, and say just colonizer. That's what they did. Or, stop using words like arrived, the Spanish invaded. There are ways it's like you're conveying the same information, but you're being a little bit more direct about it and less passive in a way. So I think those types of choices are really where you can elevate the language of museum exhibition labels to appeal to both sort of specialists, but also the public. And in a way that's you're not losing people. Because I think if you get into the real nitty gritty details of certain historical events or certain narratives, then sometimes you do lose a general audience member. Yeah, like I said, I think with what helps is collecting good examples of something that you think is really well done. So as a young curator, I would say, go around, and if you say like, wow, this exhibition really hit it home, take pictures of the labels and think about why it did and what language you can sort of incorporate into your own curatorial practice from the exhibitions you've liked and respected. That helped me a lot. And, also just talking to people. I think, if I had unlimited budget, unlimited time, unlimited space, Arte del Mar could have been something totally different. But I did have a really great sort of group of interlocutors that I was checking in with about sort of from a scholarly perspective or from the perspective of a contemporary artist or the perspective of like an intern with a Caribbean background. What would you like to see in this label? And if you read this introductory text, what does that say to you? So I think getting a lot of feedback is really important too. So you're not just a curator like in your office writing your own thing and it's in this bubble, because you really want it to resonate with different audiences and you want it to not alienate anyone as best you can. That was another reason I really pushed to present the introductory text, at least in English and Spanish, because of course I would want all texts in museums to be both languages in New York, as it is basically 30 to 40% of the city speaking Spanish in their homes. But, baby steps, and having that accessibility for people whose Spanish is their first language was really important. And that was another thing that I wanted to really do. And it actually, producing a really strong Spanish introduction made me really push harder for the English, because I realized, I'm kind of saying this, but I'm not really meaning that, So actually the having that bilingual treatment improved, I think, the English as well. So there are a lot of ways that you can present a new way of talking about things through language choices. And, sometimes it's difficult to work in institutions that have a certain way of doing things, but I think recent rethinkings of how museums present material allow for opportunities to come up with new strategies for language use.
Can you share what those conversations are sometimes like with the pushback when describing certain words? So instead of conquistadors, colonizers.
Without getting too specific, I think, for example, the caciques, these are rulers of the ancient Taínos. They could be male or female. And we know that very clearly from the chronicles that these Spanish colonizers wrote in the first decades of the colonial period, which was only in the Antilles. It's all about word count sometimes, like you just have to cut things. So at some point, if an editor could argue, oh, well, isn't it implied if you say caciques that these could be men and women? And it's really not. Because I think, especially when we're looking at the ancient Americas, there's not as much recognition of female leadership or rulership. But recent research shows that there's a lot going on. And this is an example with the Taínos that we actually have historical records that show this was a female role as well. The cacica, that was the Spanish way of gendering it back then. So I think those types of things you can just push back as a curator and say, no, it's actually really important that people realize that these were men and women, because it's probably not assumed. It's also about specificity, because you do have limited text count. Instead of saying conquistador, it's like, but there's a whole faction of people that would argue, I think successfully, that there was no conquest and it's ongoing. So let's not even reference that because it's not precise enough, right? Let's be precise. These were colonizers who came and colonized. That was what they did. I think having an argument for the precision of language is also a good strategy when you're dealing with, different stakeholders like editors and designers that really have, physical constraints. It would be great to put all of your thoughts of nuanced things on the wall, but sometimes you have to make tough choices. People respond well to arguments for, no, actually, this is a more precise term than something that was proposed. Going back to our point about the sort of elevation of the language about the Taínos, making it clear that there was also agency on the part of the Taínos, instead of calling it a conquest or defeated or this kind of thing, talk about it as an ongoing struggle, or really underscore that there was resistance that was successful for let's say decades, right? It's about just kind of stepping back from getting pushback from whoever it is and just saying, this is the reason why we have to make this kind of on the forefront, even if it's something that isn't something that people have encountered before.
So you've spoken and written about the lack of knowledge and research on Taíno people because of colonialism and assimilation of language and religion. Your catalog beautifully details the craft and symbols of the works on display, but how are you and your research and curatorial team solving for the historical gaps and memories of these objects?
That's a great question. Going to the first part of it, I actually heard from a lot of people while the exhibition was up, especially people who grew up, say, in Puerto Rico. They said, I didn't learn any of this in school. Or, maybe we learned like a little bit, but then I didn't know any of this. And I think that's a wider problem in the United States, is that we don't really learn much about the indigenous legacies of what is now this country, including Puerto Rico, which is sort of a colonial territory of the country. So, I think that's a real problem. And it's an ongoing kind of erasure of whatever happened before 1776, right? And so in a broad sense, I think we all need to do more to indigenize our narratives of what we learn in school or what we teach in school, those of us who do teach. I would say also there's this great legacy of Taíno words that we use all the time: barbecue, hammock, savannah. Cacique is still used, arreito in Spanish, iguana. I mean, these are all Taíno words. And how can you say that this isn't part of our sort of current contemporary culture or language? But I think there was this erroneous narrative that the Spanish wiped out all of the indigenous peoples of the islands. And certainly there was great devastation because of disease and genocidal violent acts, but there was great resilience as well. When you're thinking about how do you present that in a museum, it's about focusing on the people, right? Because I think a lot of people coming to see indigenous American objects in a place like the Met or in an anthropology museum, in previous ways of presenting the material, there's this kind of idea that the objects kind of bubble up from the culture. There's no individual artist. There's no individual genius that produced this. This isn't like the Michelangelo of, Hispaniola of the 15th century. When we're describing these, and in both publications and in the galleries, it's about, instead of saying this was sculpted from wood, you can say an artist sculpted this hardwood, so it's really just about framing it as such so that you can bring people into this world of really an exciting cultural setting that may be unfamiliar to them. But they can understand when you talk about people, and they can understand when you talk about this is a portable throne, because they understand thrones and they understand royalty wanting to have a privileged place to sit in a ceremony. People understand gold. I mean, people understand jade. They understand valuable materials. It's kind of like, in People magazine, they're like, celebrities are just like us. It's like, it's kind of about not othering these peoples that really aren't that different from what people may be familiar with from European or Asian traditions, for example.
Can you share any behind the scenes where the objects will continue to be investigated and researched, and not just a one-off exhibition? Are there similar examinations of other cultures in the works that you're doing, that the museum is doing in general?
Well, I have a couple of follow-up projects of things that I didn't get to talk about in Arte del Mar. So one of them is pertaining to really this term cacique that was recorded very early on in Columbus's first letter back. It's an interesting term because then the Spanish take that term and apply it to other indigenous leaders everywhere, from Mexico to Peru in the 16th century, but then expands to the southwestern United States into Canada. And so there are caciques from the Arctic to the Antarctic, but I think that obscured the original meaning of the word. And in fact, I think it was based on a misunderstanding of what the Taínos were in the first place, because the original observers, it's all about, these are reyes, these are señores, these are royal people. And there was a kind of divine mandate. There was this spiritual aspect to their leadership as well, that was based on this Zemí that I mentioned before, this kind of idea. When you apply that term cacique to like a mid-level, basically bureaucrat in the Aztec Empire, it's losing that meaning. Then you try and use it in Peru when they already had indigenous Quechua terms like curaca for like that type of political leader. You're equating things that were totally not the same thing. What I would argue is, then of course the problem is you have all these caciques coming up. And so then you have people in the mid 20th century kind of trying to place people in categories of complexity, political anthropologists doing it. And they say, oh, and look at these caciques. These were chiefdoms. They were not state. But it's like, but cacique didn't mean chief until it did that in English until the late 18th century. Like before that, it was actually rey or príncipe or señor. Suddenly you have these political anthropologists arguing that these are non-state level, non-royal agents, these caciques, when that is far from the truth. That's not what the original observer said. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it could turn into something where I'm going to give a presentation about it soon. And I'd like to kind of challenge people to rethink this use of the word chief when you're talking about caciques, because that's not what it means. It doesn't capture the original meaning of that term. And I think because of that, we actually have kind of diluted our understanding of the rich diversity in ancient American politics up until the time of colonization. So, and even after. Anyway, I've been kind of talking to a couple of people that know more about the colonial period than me. I'm hoping to develop that into something. And so that was kind of something that came up in Arte del Mar, but wasn't super relevant to the exhibition itself. Yeah, another thing, there will be actually a big exhibition on classic Maya civilization that will focus on the arts of deities. That will open in November of this year, 2022, at the Met. The title's Lives of the Gods, Divinity and Maya Art. And that will be also traveling to the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth in 2023. So that was a project I initiated while still at the Met before I came to Penn State. And several colleagues are working now to bring that to fruition, both at the Met and catalog authors from all around the world. So that will be an exciting treatment of really kind of religious art of the classic Maya and bringing it to the forefront as a case study that people should know when we talk about religious art. You know, everybody thinks about Edith Hamilton's mythology as this kind of thing for Greek and Roman traditions, but there are just as complicated and beautiful visual traditions of deities and divine beings in the Americas. And so really kind of starting with the ancient Maya, because we have what they wrote, that's the big advantage. That's, I think, a really exciting project that I'm happy to be involved with. And I'm grateful for the Met and the Kimball for really, keeping it afloat during COVID, right? Because it was all very touch and go about what exhibitions could stay on the calendar. But it's really exciting to see that these two institutions are partnering with ministries in countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, to bring up some really wonderful sculptures and painted vessels from the national collections so that people in New York and Texas can gain a better appreciation for the Maya gods.
That's exciting. Just to hear. I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for
stay tuned. November, it'll open in New York.
I'm ready. You included a piece by Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam to remind the viewer that Taínos do not end with this exhibit, but are still here. You have said in other interviews you wish you could expand on the contemporary Taíno artists. Have you found any, and what is that process? You've included a few in the catalog at the end.
I had a lot of different options for that coda, that sort of end work in the exhibition, but I was drawn to Wilfredo Lam because he wasn't so literally referencing the Taínos, but it was more about this transformation of indigenous culture and religion and ideas and practices with the forced migration of enslaved peoples from Africa. And so that's a really important story for the Caribbean. And so I wanted to kind of include that perspective to talk about artistic exchange, just as we were talking about before the Spanish colonizers invaded. We can think about the artistic exchange in the Caribbean continuing to today. And that really brings in these traditions of Afro-Indigenous religions like Voodoo or Santeria, Lukmi, that have inspired artists for a long time. And so Lam creates this beautiful world of spirits and figures from these religions that have West African origins, but definitely incorporated indigenous ideas as they spread through the islands. So that was why I went with Wilfredo Lam. But honestly, there are a lot of artists both in the Caribbean region and in diaspora communities in New York, Florida, LA, Chicago that are referencing Taíno works in their own practice. But I think it was exciting to include that Wilfredo Lam painting as a kind of jumping off point. Yeah, if I could have included more in Arte del Mar, I would have probably included some more colonial material because there's really fascinating transcultural objects that were produced in these kind of hybrid Catholic, indigenous, African religious contexts. One of the best things about that 1973 exhibition was the marriage of the ancestral works from the Taínos and the contemporary works from both the island of Puerto Rico, but also New Yorkers, these New Yorkers that were either born in Puerto Rico and grew up in New York or were born in New York to Puerto Rican families. So there's a lot to do with a place like the Met. You could really build a lot of partnerships with contemporary artists in New York that are thinking about Afro-Indigenous or Taíno issues in their own work. And one way we were able to do this, not necessarily in a visual way, but in a sort of thematic way, right before COVID for Black History Month, we hosted a panel with several artists, most of which have studios in New York, and a professor from Queens College, Lawrence Waldron, who's one of the few art historians really tackling the ancestral work of the Caribbean and talking about these Afro-Indigenous questions. Because I think the Afro-Caribbean story often gets subsumed in national narratives about Black history when it really is a very important part of both places like Puerto Rico, but also New York, Florida, all these real places where there's a great Caribbean tradition and ancestry. So yeah, there are a lot of artists out there that I think could have contributed to the visual story if we had had more of a spatial component for contemporary work. It could be also exciting to commission something. Like we worked with Miguel Luciano with a 3D model of one of the sculptures from that collection to do a performative and rebirth almost of the sculpture. And that's not even the first time. Another artist that I spoke to, Jorge Gonzalez from Puerto Rico, had actually replicated parts, quoted some of the ancestral sculptures from the Met and in his own installation. So, it was already happening. And I think we could have brought together an exciting group of people to think about what are contemporary artists doing that are part of this story as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Miguel Luciano, Met's artist in resident, who had spent 3 years researching the museum's collection, culminating in an exhibition in Block Party. How have you and the museum been exploring community? And how do you hope to incorporate collaborative projects into future exhibitions regarding culture and memory?
I think museums are more open now to having community input on exhibitions before they're installed. So for example, can you invite contemporary artists to write labels for ancestral works? My colleagues that are doing more with Native American art in an art museum context are doing that more and more to have these collaborative knowledge production cycles in exhibitions. So I think that that's something that could be really exciting for a Caribbean context because there's so many great thinkers and artists and poets and, these great artistic and creative traditions in the community of Caribbean diaspora and in the islands themselves that can only make a project like Arte del Mar richer or a big exhibition on Caribbean art. It really inspired me. That was as an archaeologist, it was really exciting for me to start doing that as someone who was really focused on the past. And my questions were much more sort of archaeological and kind of that's like my nerdy pleasure, right? But to recognize that it only improves the project to bring in these other perspectives that may be totally approaching the material totally different from you as a curator, as a scholar. I think these types of collaborative ways of exhibiting material are really what audiences are expecting moving forward too.
You alluded a little bit to sort of in a perfect world, COVID happened. There's a lot of digital changes. But in reading the New York Times review of Arte del Mar, Jason Farrago notes the small size of the exhibition in relation to the amount of island hopping a museum will experience or had experienced. Given time in a perfect world, what would be your ideal vision for presenting Arte del Mar? You've talked a lot about the investigation and the research, but I'm interested more as sort of the eye as a curator, like your passion, your interest.
Yeah, I think, it was great to read that review in the New York Times. I mean, it's totally surreal to see that. I thought it was really exciting because the reviewer walked away saying, I wanted more, and I think that's what anybody wants to hear, right? I think I was somewhat expecting that. I think that if we could have included more colonial material, like I mentioned before, or more of a contemporary art story, then that could have brought things full circle a little bit more. If I had, unlimited resources, again, I would have loved to take some time and worked with colleagues in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, to bring up some of the real treasures of the archaeology of those islands, because the limitation of time with Arte del Mar necessitated using really sort of domestic loans and not really far away ones. So I think that one of the things I would have loved to do is bring everybody to the table as kind of a research team to think about how can we really represent Cuba, for example, because that's a huge part of the Taíno story that people in the US don't have access to most of the time. So how can we do that? Another thing is some of the real highlights of Taíno creativity are only existing in European museums because they were taken or co-opted or just stolen in the colonization of the Antilles. So we have some really stunning things that could just be showstoppers for people that aren't familiar with Taíno art. If you're doing an exhibition, you want that wow moment where people turn a corner and they're just so shocked by what they see because it's so beautiful or it's so complex or it's so different from what they were expecting, that you can create those moments that stick with people and inspire people to continue learning about that. I would say it would have been great to have more collaboration with different countries, especially in the Caribbean region. As another example, there's some fascinating material from Venezuela. And I didn't really have the time or resources to go into it, but some beautiful pottery traditions from Venezuela that are hallmarks of Caribbean art and before colonization, but very few exist outside of Venezuela itself, and very little is known about the archaeological context. But Venezuela is the gateway to the Antilles. So that's where people were migrating from in waves back and forth for millennia in the Caribbean. That was another thing that for time and logistics, it was impossible to travel and visit and talk with colleagues in Venezuela. So those types of things, I think, could be like pie in the sky goals for a future Caribbean exhibition, for sure.
Yeah, that all sounds exciting, being able to travel.
Yeah, I remember traveling, right?
So now we've kind of lived through COVID. But also in 2020, we witnessed a shift in our culture and society, and museums are now addressing land acknowledgements and equity pledges into their collections. In your experience as a museum professional with extensive experience working in prestigious institutions, can you speak to that change? How might addressing systemic and institutional racism change exhibitions, research, and community engagement? What would you like to see when entering into an exhibition presenting on non-Western culture? What aren't you seeing that you would like to?
These are all really big, important questions. And I think I can sum it up by several of my colleagues at a conference on Native American art in museums. And this is something that's been written about extensively in the past decades, is if art museums, anthropology museums, science museums, if they adopt a collaborative and relationship building approach to curation of exhibitions, then the phrase is nothing about us without us, right? And I think that's a really strong, pithy statement to think about as a curator, regardless of your identity, regardless of your background, to think, okay, if I'm going to talk about these issues, I at least need to consult with some people that are stakeholders in this discussion and in this knowledge production. So I think that that's something that in 2020, more museums that may have not really been confronted with those issues before really were. And I think they are now taking those types of approaches seriously. And that's only a good thing, because like I said, bringing on other voices that approach the material in different ways can only improve what you do as a curator, and it can only improve the museum's presentation of the material. That can be something about land acknowledgements, but I think even now, I think people are expecting museums to go one step further and say, okay, that's nice that you acknowledge this, you did this statement, but what are you doing about it? Like, how are you changing what you're doing? How are you bringing the people in that have been displaced from the very land that the museum sits on? Those kinds of questions, I think, are now what are facing museums going forward. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about the privilege that comes with the museum in the first place, thinking about the colonial context of a lot of the collections in museums, whether that is sort of direct, which is like, we colonized this place and took these things, or indirect, like this thing appeared on the art market in the 20th century, but was clearly stolen in this event in 1897 in the court of Benin, for example. How do we acknowledge those histories? How do museums just be honest about things? And how do we build relationships with people in different stakeholder groups, whether that's indigenous peoples in a country or a sort of national patrimony infrastructure of a country, like a ministry or a national museum? There are a lot of different levels of that type of collaboration. But I think with this look at what museums are and what the origins of a lot of museums are, people are really addressing those changes, some for the first time in the museum's history. But I mean, at the same time, I do want to say, like, there is a kind of public assumption that museums aren't thinking about this, but that's not remotely true. I mean, that's like the stuff that keeps museum professionals up at night, and it's not that there's this kind of like behind the curtain attitude, like I'm going to do this and not listen to anybody. It's more about we're just all trying to do our best, And so I think there is a kind of middle ground there of let's realize that a lot of these museums don't have the resources of some of the bigger, deep-pocketed, older institutions. And so how can they do the best within their means? Another thing that I've seen more is people just admitting when they're wrong. I mean, just say you're sorry. Like, it's not, nobody would fault you for that. It's the type of behavior that is sort of hiding things or not admitting things. It's sort of like, just say, look, this is how it was. We're sorry. We're not doing it that way anymore. This is how we're planning to address this. We want your feedback moving forward. Everybody just needs to like move on and try and do better rather than trying to control the narrative, because I don't know, life's really short. That's my look at it. It's sort of like, let's just get together at the table and talk about what's the best way to move forward. And it may work, it may leave somebody out, but we'll learn from that. I mean, you have to try and think about the mission, which is, let's bring these stories that we care about, that we're passionate about, to the public, to the world. Because now with COVID, for better, for worse, people are more accustomed to learning online. So how can we reach even more people than can come to the galleries or read the book of an exhibition? So I think there's a lot of responsibility, but at the same time, it's a really exciting opportunity to just do better as museums, because there's a community role there that hasn't changed, but it has sort of expanded it.
There's hope. Well, thank you for joining me. Do you have any announcements that you want to make? Any projects you want to throw out there?
Like I said, the Met will be presenting this wonderful exhibition of art of the classic Maya deities that will start in November. So that's a really exciting thing. And museums are more investing in areas of art history or archaeology that haven't historically been focused on. So I think there's a lot of exciting work across the board in colleagues in different museums all across the country that in the coming years will really bring to the forefront some of these exciting things from the Americas. People will love it.
I know I will. I'm ready.
I have been your host, Soy Elena. Join us on our next episode, and in the meantime, be sure to follow us on social media to learn about opportunities, events, and more.